Phil Pott come and join us again. He is going to speak for a few minutes on a short topic of the Black Robe Regiment.
I'm thankful to be here tonight. Thank you, Tracy, for inviting me. Thank you, Melissa, for your kind words. And I'm looking forward to actually hearing Bill Blake tonight. And so I only have a few minutes to talk about a topic. I'm Eric Philpott. I'm the pastor of Cross Life Church. We pastor a church, my co-minister and I, AJ, there in Allen. And we consider ourselves to be a Black Robe Regiment church. And our caption for our church is a Patriot Bible church. And we're very involved in being a part of our communities, being a part of candidates that are running for office, even in Dallas. Kurt Longus is running for sheriff there. So praise God for you running here in Collin County. Thank you very much. Are you familiar with the Black Robe Regiment?
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. I want to give you just a little bit of a history, and then I want to talk with you about the impact that it had then and the impact that it needs to have today. The year, as you may know, was 1775. It was April 18th. The British troops were stationed in Boston, and they were going to make a move on the ammunitions and the arms that they had there in Concord. Lexington was located right in between there, and there were two men that were commissioned that night to look for a sign that if the British troops started to move to take these munitions, that they would go and they would warn others, the Minutemen, if you will, that would actually come to guard. That night, the British troops crossed the Charles River, and they did it by night, about 10 o'clock in the evening. And there was two lights that were up in the old North Tower. One was if they came by land, two if by sea, and it was by sea. And I can only imagine that the men that were commissioned to do this, which was the one that we know most, Paul Revere, and William Dawes was the other. But they weren't satisfied with that, so they commissioned 30 other riders to make sure that they were ready in case something happened to them. And they call those the Sons of Liberty. You might be familiar with that as well. I can only imagine what it looked like that night when Paul Revere was there and he saw those lights come on. Most people don't know that they were only there for 6 seconds. One, and then the second, and then they were extinguished. In that moment, people had to move. Paul Revere got on his horse and he charged towards Concord, but he stopped. He stopped in Lexington. And he stopped at a particular man's house, and the man's name was the Reverend Jonas Clark. See, in Boston, the British troops were looking for two men, John Hancock and Samuel Adams. And when Paul Revere rode up to the house, there were 8 men that were actually guarding the home that night. And they had explicit instructions not to bother them once they went to sleep. And Paul Revere said there will be noise enough coming soon. The British are coming. And when they went inside, there was the Reverend who pastored the church there in Lexington, and the two men, John Hancock and Samuel Adams. An amazing thing was actually said that night, because John Hancock looks over to the Reverend Jonas Clark, and he says, "Do you think the men are ready?" And the Reverend said, "I've trained them for this night." They met at the Lexington Green, which is just adjacent to the church. They met in a muster of about 130 men at first, but there was no word that the British were coming, and they dispersed, only to re-muster at the sound of the drums. The sound of the drums came in the morning, and about 70 men were able to muster up to the Lexington Green. And those 70 men stood there with their rifles loaded, ball and powder, as 800 British troops began to march towards them. And they were told to put their weapons down. Put their weapons down and disperse, you villains. And with that, a shot was fired from their commander, and then a volley of fire came to the church grounds. 7 men lay dead. As they were dispersing, others were trying to get to the muster. The Deacon Parker actually told them to disband, told them to disperse. He could see that they were outnumbered. And men began to fire back at the British troops in defense of themselves, getting back to their homes to provide defense for their families. I think it's an amazing thing when you think of the Black Robe Regiment, because this was a name that was given not to some elite group of men that had been trained by the colonial armies, but it was men that stood behind pulpits and wore black robes on Sunday. And they preached for years prior to this night. They preached about liberty. They preached about freedom. They preached about truth. They preached about what tyranny was, so that the people were well versed in exactly what it was that was happening to them. And they could see in Scripture that not even only if they didn't take care of their families, that they were worse than infidels, that they had the right to defend themselves against a tyrannical government. Many of the pastors today that I talk with don't know anything about the Black Robe Regiment, what it meant. But it made a huge impact, because if it had not been for the Black Robe Regiment, then we wouldn't have the freedoms that we have today, because that night would have gone completely different. Men still rode to Concord, and at Concord there was a greater number of forces, still with pastors in the ranks, and mostly men of the church that stood in defense of their family and of their nations. Now, I know that there's great men who were dealing with some atrocities of government overreach. Nazi Germany was one of them. There were men like Bonhoeffer that actually stood in defense. Although a pacifist, he was very active in helping to thwart the Axis powers, the Nazi powers. I think we need that today. I think we need that today more than we've ever needed it. Any given Sunday, millions of people are going to church, and they're not hearing anything about what's going on with our political system, in our local government. They don't know who's running for sheriff. They don't even know that the sheriff is actually there to interpose on your behalf. Who is going to talk with them about these things? It should be the pastors. I want to encourage you to encourage your pastor to get actively involved. And if he gives you any huff, give him my number. Better yet, let me have his number. And I'll get in touch with him and talk with him. Because all this is history. This is history. And we all know that those who fail to understand history or to know history are only doomed to repeat it. Now, we watch nation after nation after nation throughout history fall because their government overreaches the lives of the people and ultimately takes away their ability to defend themselves. Whether it's taking away their voice or it's taking away their guns, they no longer have a right to say, hey, I can defend myself. I think Scripture is very clear that we have that right to do that. And Romans 13 is not just about honoring your government, as many pastors would actually say, but it actually says that that government is actually there for the good of the people. And it is a sword against those that are evil. And when a government begins to move and does evil things to good people, somebody should stand up. Amen. That somebody should be you. That somebody should be me. That somebody should be us. So I want to encourage you that hope is not over. I have great hope that we can turn things around, if not for one story in the Bible. And that is the story of Nineveh. And if Nineveh can actually be scheduled for judgment in 40 days and has a reluctant prophet walk in who doesn't really want to tell them to repent, but he does it anyway, and the whole nation repents with fasting, and God spares them, I believe that we can do that too. I want to just close, and thank you for the time, with something that Scripture says, because we're really not waiting for the politicians to change their policies. God's not waiting for that either. God's not waiting for the homosexual community to change their views of lifestyle or how it should affect society. God is waiting for his people. 2 Chronicles chapter 7 and verse 14. God says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face, turn from their wicked ways, then I'll hear from heaven, I'll forgive your sins, and I'll restore the lands. Is anybody else interested in restoring the lands? Me too. God gives us a plan. And I think it's a plan that worked well during the Revolutionary Army where pastors were preaching it. And I believe it's something that pastors need to be doing again because we want to know what God's view is on these issues. Amen? And so the Black Road Regiment was a part of making that happen. Thank you.
Bill Blake is the chairman of the Lincoln Society. We are happy to welcome him. He is exceptionally qualified to speak on the failings of socialism and communism. Bill holds a master's with honors from the London School of Economics. He conducted graduate research with the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the UN Development Program, and the Islamic Development Bank. He has published many works on more than a dozen topics. Bill is a lifelong Republican and began delivering leaflets supporting Ronald Reagan in 1976. He has served in leadership capacities with various Republican organizations, including his current leadership with the Lincoln Society, the oldest co-ed Republican organization in Collin County, which meets once a month at noon. Professionally, Bill is a financial analyst, serving many families in 3 foreign countries and 9 U.S. states. He and his wife Vicki have 3 children, live in Plano, and attend Stonebriar Community Church. Please give a warm welcome to Bill Blake.
We're here to talk about socialism rising, and we're going to talk about Britain a little bit. We're going to talk about a good example in this very presentation about why we really, truly cannot know. Anybody who's been watching the news or the capital markets, certainly the behavior of the capital markets this week, would come to the conclusion that they confidently know that Britain is going to stay in the European Union. They cannot know that. They do not know that. If, in fact, Britain votes to leave the European Union tonight, it's going to be chaos tomorrow. And Bill will be a busy man yet again. This looks like a pretty informal crowd. Does anybody mind if I shed my jacket? No. Loosen my tie? Thank you, I appreciate that very much. I think we can do that when we're among friends, right?
That's right.
I get a lot of questions. The genesis of this project began some time ago, really began about 3 years ago. I was asked to be the keynote speaker at the Rollins College of Business and the Economic Department of Texas Tech University. It was their graduation ceremony. And before I gave my fairly boring address, I went around and I was introduced to all the graduating seniors. And as I'm shaking their hands, I started asking the same question of all of them. So what's next for you? And an interesting thing happened that day. When I asked graduating seniors who were immigrants, Central America, South America, Africa, and Asia, the answers that I got were, I have to be at my internship next Thursday. I've been accepted to grad school at such and such. I have an entry-level position at this place. They certainly did not have their lives mapped out, but they did know their next step. And all too often when I ask the same question of typical middle income, upper middle income kids who clearly had grown up in traditional American families, the answer that I heard was, I don't know, this was a lot of work. It's a lot harder than I thought it was going to be. I think I'm going to take the summer off, figure out in the fall. I think I'd like to go to grad school, but I'm not really sure where. I don't really know what I want to study. These were kids who were graduating with their bachelor's degrees.
Oh, man.
And they had no idea what their next step was going to be. And that led me to start asking a lot more questions. One of the things that we're going to see tonight are results of some research that Pew has done with regard to millennials. And I think we're going to be terribly disappointed at what we see, but it's important in understanding this subject. This is Bernie. If you did not know this, in this primary season, the 6 largest political events were Bernie Sanders events. Not Donald Trump, not Hillary Clinton, not Ted Cruz, the Bernie. Let me give you the Reader's Digest. Socialism really is one thing, and that is an idea that the group is more important than the individual. Everything else stems from that. Your right to personal property, your ability to conduct your own affairs, your right to make choices are less important than the group. And when this concept gets applied politically, what you find out is that it really is about the ruling group and their power base. We all know that, right? We understand that. This group understands. Let's talk a little bit about the past. You can't know anything about socialism if you don't know where it came from. Actually, the idea of socialism goes back, it precedes the Greeks. Let's not go that far back, we don't have much time. Of course, this is Karl Marx, who published in 1848 the Communist Manifesto. Marx was probably the most influential speaker, author, and developer of formative, what we would call modern socialism today. Essentially, he believed that tensions within the capitalist system would eventually cause its demise. And what would rise up would be something that we would laughingly call a utopia. This is a quote from Karl Marx. The theory of socialism may be summed up in the single sentence, the abolition of private property. If you have no right to private property, then you have really nothing except what the government allows you to have. Democracy, Karl Marx believed, is actually the road to socialism. That seems strange. Wait a minute, what? Well, Marx wanted to achieve goal, and he understood that democracy could be used toward that goal. For most of the 19th century, socialism was theoretical, right? It was the talk of the coffee houses of that day. It became more and more tangible through the emerging system of trade unions, where socialist theory seemed applicable to the woes of the worker. The first substantive political achievement for socialism came in Germany in 1893 when the Social Democratic Party won 1.8 million votes. By 1912, the SDP claimed a plurality but did not rule in the Imperial Reichstag. Interestingly enough, with some minor gaps in history, Germany's Socialist Democracy Party exists today. It's still there, and it's still very much an influential force. In Russia, where democracy proved too slow a road for socialism, armed revolution created the world's first socialist nation. That's an actual photograph, and yeah, those are bodies. Those are people who would resist the revolution. So then socialism became the defining argument of the 20th century. It became the thing that gave birth to the Cold War. No Bolshevik, no communist, no intelligent socialist has ever entertained the idea of violence against the middle peasants. All socialists have always spoken of agreement with them and of their gradual and voluntary transition to socialism.
Yeah, right.
Stalin, his successor, Marxism is not only the theory of socialism, it is an integral world outlook, a philosophical system from which Marxist proletarian socialism logically follows. This system is called dialectical materialism. It's all about stripping power from the individual and elevating the group, or more to the point, those who control the group. America is like a healthy body, and its resistance is threefold. It's patriotism, it's morality, and it's spiritual life. If we can undermine these three areas, America will collapse from within. Where's Pastor Philpott? Can I get an amen? Most people have never heard of Antonio Gramsci. He was a foot soldier for the expansion of Soviet socialism into Europe. Socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. In the New Order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society. He said that in 1924. Georges Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France during World War I. Whoever was not a socialist in youth will be a scoundrel in his old age. The reason that that slide is up there because it kind of shows you how the leadership of the day in Western Europe really didn't take socialism seriously as a system. It was more of an attitude, and we can deal with attitudes, or so opponents have thought. George Bernard Shaw, Irish playwright, Nobel laureate, and very definitely a socialist. Socialism is the same as communism, only better English. That was an attitude that took hold in Britain around the turn of the century. Oh, well, now, socialism sounds better than communism. It allows us to shape the word. Who knows Norman Thomas? Anybody ever heard of Norman Thomas? Very good. 6-time presidential candidate for the Socialist Party of America, and unfortunately a Presbyterian minister. The American people will never knowingly adopt socialism, but under the name of liberalism, they will adopt every fragment of the socialist program until one day America will be a socialist nation without even knowing how it happened. And we know that to be true. John Steinbeck. Steinbeck was a conflicted liberal. At times he would turn on the liberals, and at other times he would embrace liberalism. He was not politically astute, but he could turn a good phrase. Socialism never took root in America because the poor see themselves not as an exploited proletariat, but as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. What if we all thought like that? I'd love to be a temporarily embarrassed millionaire. There is no difference between communism and socialism except in the means of achieving the same ultimate end. Communism proposes to enslave men by force. Socialism by vote. Democracy. It is merely the difference between murder and suicide. Ayn Rand. For those of you who don't know, Ayn Rand fled the Soviet Union, became a prolific author, novelist, playwright, philosopher. Frederick Hayek. I studied under the Austrian School of Economics, and we won't go into that, because that's very boring for a great man. Frederick Hayek founded, if any of you are familiar with the kind of a pro-entrepreneurial, pro-free enterprise school of thought that came out of the University of Chicago School of Business. They had this man to thank. He left London and went to Chicago. If socialists understood economics, they wouldn't be socialists. We'll touch more on that in a minute. His hero, Ludwig von Mises, who was one of the founders of the Austrian School of Economics, What pushes the masses into the camp of socialism is even more than the illusion that socialism will make them richer, the expectation that it will curb all those who are better than they themselves are. It's not going to get me ahead, but it's going to push that guy down. If history could teach us anything, it would be that private property is inextricably linked with civilization. The welfare state is merely a method for transforming the market economy step by step into socialism. Right? We know that to be true too. Then people tax themselves into prosperity. Then a man stand in a bucket and lift himself up by the handle. I think socialism is the philosophy of failure, the creed of ignorance, and the gospel of envy. Its inherent virtue is the equal sharing of misery, not prosperity. Okay. If you've seen this presentation before at the Lincoln Society, you're about to see the director's cut. There were certain slides in the original presentation I eliminated, not based on philosophy, but based on, in a lunch meeting, you only got so much time. So the slides that you're about to see did not appear in the original presentation. Warning, have paramedics on standby. I don't think there's a liberal in this room. But in the odd chance that there might be, you're probably going to need medical attention. Meanwhile, another form of socialism had taken hold in Central Europe, National Socialism. The liberals will go to every length to tell you that the Nazis were not socialists. Form your own conclusions. Liberals disavow the Nazi movement as if it had nothing to do with true socialism. In both the German and the Russian forms of socialism, the government has full control of the means of production. You do not cross the government. It decides what will be produced and how, and it determines what the individual will receive. The idea that German industrialists or Marxists in Nazi Germany were somehow free to act as they saw fit is nonsense. National Socialists directed production decisions, commanded labor, wages, and interest rates, used punitive taxation and huge fines to redistribute wealth to state interests, curbed entrepreneurship, and confiscated assets and operations. That sounds anything like the last 7 years. This is an obscure book to find, but if you like economics and you like history and you want to be able to argue a liberal into an absolute conniption fit, find that book. The Vampire Economy, written by Gunther Reimann. This book was published in 1939 in New York by Vanguard. Gunther, as you might have figured out, was German. He had been in Germany during the ascendancy of the Nazi regime. Of course, he grew up in Germany and, thankfully for him, had the means to escape, pretty much at the last minute. He documents in this book how industry was merely the agent of the National Socialist state. Property rights, business licensing, regulation, control, confiscation, and imprisonment were merely the tools of effecting total state control. It's about the group, not the individual. Hitler. Liberals will go to great lengths to contort themselves to deny this quote. But this is a documented quote. You have to put this into historical context. You see Hitler in his short pants. This photograph and this quote came from 1927. In a speech that Hitler was giving, which mostly had to do with Lebensraum, living space. There was a section devoted to economics. We are socialists, We are enemies of the capitalistic economic system for the exploitation of the economically weak, with its unfair salaries, with its unseemly evaluation of a human being according to wealth and property instead of responsibility and performance, and we are determined to destroy this system under all conditions. Now, liberals will try and argue that all Hitler was trying to do was stir up all those unemployed men in Germany in 1927. But when you look at what the Nazis did, when you look at what Nazi public policy was about, from a standpoint of freedom, it's very clear that he meant what he said. We're going to take away the power of the individual. We're going to take away the things that incentivize people to develop their wealth and their success. And we're going to fuse everything into the needs of the state. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Propaganda. As socialists, we are opponents of the Jews because we see in the Hebrews the incarnation of capitalism, of the misuse of the nation's goods. To be a socialist is to submit the I to the thou. Socialism is sacrificing the individual to the whole. Well, this was the guy who was in charge of the message. Public policy priorities of National Socialism. Absolute authority over the state, of the state over the economy. Universal employment through government works projects. Infrastructure. Got to invest money in infrastructure. We'll put everybody on the public payroll. Government-mandated educational curriculum. What we would call indoctrination. And they did too. Nationalized health care. Gun control and confiscation. I don't have to explain that to this crowd. Sometimes I do. Sometimes the crowd doesn't know what it is. Abortion. Abortion. Absolutely. We will extinguish the procreation of those whom we do not wish to expand their numbers. Vilifying and confiscating wealth. The most common tools that the Nazis used against the private sector were charges of profiteering, were charges of exploitation. One might call those charges of social justice. We must never underestimate that which socialism is capable of. Never underestimate what it is capable of. May 10, 1940. Churchill becomes Prime Minister when Neville Chamberlain, based in our time, the architect of appeasement, resigns. That same day, Hitler invaded France and the Low Countries. Churchill immediately begins to rally Parliament and the people in preparation for war. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And here's Mr. Churchill trying his hand at a short-barreled Bren machine gun. As bombs rained destruction on Britain, Churchill walked the streets through rubble and death. Fear. And he showed the British people that we will not be vanquished. This is just part of what he did. The British people became dependent upon his strength to persevere. I've stood on that street corner, doesn't look anything like that today. He saw them through pain, loss, despair, deprivation. He was their inspiration to fight on. On May 8, 1945, almost exactly 5 years after he took office, we celebrated VE Day. These are the streets of London coming out to celebrate VE, and Londoners hoping to just catch sight of Winston Churchill. man who had led them to their darkest hour. Just 2 months later, July 5th, now you think about this, poll was taken on July 4th. On that poll, Winston Churchill commanded an 83% popularity rating in Britain. And the very next day, he lost his job. Winston Churchill, while the war was still being fought in Asia, was removed from office. Now, truthfully, it took him about 2 weeks to count the votes. And it was a little bit longer until the transition happened. But the fact of the matter is, Winston Churchill was removed from office during World War II. Most people don't know that. And what took him out? Socialism. Led by this man right here, Clement Attlee. See, Attlee saw something. He knew something. As leader of the Labour Party, he understood that the British people had been deprived and had suffered for years. And he sought to capitalize on it. How? By promising something that actually can't be accomplished. Cradle to grave welfare state, full unemployment with high wages, the nationalization, that means taking from the private sector and making it owned by the government. Coal, gas, steel, utilities, airline, rail, buses, defense companies, airplane manufacturing, shipbuilding, and then imposed a high degree of central planning on that which wasn't taken. Instituted the National Health Service, council housing, labor laws, Personal Injuries Act. The Personal Injuries Act said that if you're a worker and you get harmed on the job, you will be able to sue your employer, and the deference of assumption will be given to you, not the burden of proof. Prison reform and farm subsidy. Let's talk about council housing. This is not something that means a lot to Americans. In England today, about 93% of the people live on less than 15% of the land. Why? Because you don't have the right to go buy a piece of real estate and build a house as you see fit. You have to have permission of the district council. And the district council wants the land, it wants the countryside preserved. Okay, preserved for those who already own it, and preserved for the government. And that's why today most of the people in Britain live on a very small footprint of the actual British territory. It's a means of controlling the population with the sale of free housing. Clement Attlee's 35-year socialist legacy. Yes, Virginia, that's garbage. What a fitting attribute for the socialist agenda. What's the result of 35 years of socialism in Britain? They're up to their ears in garbage. Stagnant economic growth, low growth of productivity, declining manufacturing and export, low wage growth, soaring unemployment, the lowest standards of management, crippling power of the trade unions. Britain trailed in modernization and technology. This is the country that invented radar. Right? Britain becomes known as the sick old man of Europe. And while many of Clement Attlee's socialist pillars remain today, Britain did not begin its repair until Margaret Thatcher came in. Okay? A lot of people in Britain still hate Margaret Thatcher. Socialists. The problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money. It sums it up, right? Good conservatives always pay their bills, unlike socialists who just run up other people's bills. You're not going to get a Bill Blake speech without that. Socialism only works in two places: heaven where they don't need it, and hell where they already have. Let's talk about socialism in America. Europe's a very distant place. It's not personal. Emergencies have always been the pretext on which the safeguards of individual liberty have been eroded. Frederick Hayek said that in the early 1930s. Never let a serious crisis go to waste. Rahm Emanuel. During his administration, seizing on the crisis of the Great Depression, Roosevelt rolled out his second Bill of Rights. Every American has the right, not the responsibility to seek, but the right to a job, an adequate wage, decent living, decent home, medical care, economic protection during sickness, accident, old age, or unemployment, and a good education. Turns out America did to a certain extent what Britain did with the ouster of Churchill. The difference is, we did it more than 10 years before. Just didn't know we were doing it. Francis Perkins, Secretary of Labor, died in wool socialism. Roosevelt created his Committee on Economic Security. That sounds good enough. Sounds like an admiral goal. Who did he put in charge of it? Francis Perkins, socialist. Responsible for a number of Roosevelt's alphabet socialist programs, the CCC, the PWA, the FWA. The mind behind the CES was Harry Hopkins. If you've never heard of Harry Hopkins, you should know that no one had the ear of Roosevelt as well as Hopkins did. He was responsible for the FERA, Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the Works Progress Administration, the Civil Works Administration. Closest advisor to Roosevelt, and by all accounts, was the architect of the New Deal. If you want to know more about how America got into the trouble that it's in today, read up on Harry Hopkins. The CES was the body that created and empowered Social Security. And then they brought in this man, Edward Whitman. He was a professor of the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Anybody know anything about the University of Wisconsin at Madison? Social reformer. Belonged to the American Association of Labor Legislation, the lobby. Deemed the nation's leading expert in social insurance. America didn't have any experts on social insurance. There was no such thing. But he was granted that moniker by Roosevelt himself. With Hopkins and Perkins, Whitta set out to create a total national health insurance program. They wanted permanent universal guarantees of public employment and funding through general taxation rather than payroll tax. And when they built this monstrous scheme, they put it in front of Roosevelt. And Roosevelt said, my God, we'll never get that through Congress. He was probably right. So they fell back to plan B. We'll institute this in pieces over decades if necessary. Annual spending on Social Security is now over $897 billion. That's approximately 23.5% of the annual budget today. Medicare, Medicaid, supplemental security income, earned income credits, unemployment compensation, nutrition assistance, family support, child nutrition, foster care, making work pay. Annual spending for all of that, $2.23 trillion per year. And that is 58.6% of the federal budget. Things for which our founding fathers had no concept or intention. And it's 58.6% of the annual budget. The national debt, this number's a little dated, we're sneaking up on $20 trillion. Do you realize that if the federal government had to keep its books the way that we do in the private sector, where we actually had to track all of our obligations, the national debt would exceed, at this point, over $102 trillion. $102 trillion. Why don't they have to count that? Because the government is the master of socialism. And they're not obligated to do anything for the individual. They will do for the individual as serves their purposes. And since the payment of all this, even though those dollars are really going out, is discretionary, they don't have to count it as part of the national debt. Social Security system will no longer be able to be financed by 2026. Why? Demographics mostly. We're an aging population. We are still a growing population, whereas in most of the rest of the OECD Western developed countries, they're actually shrinking in size. Well, not so much now with all the refugees. But we're still growing because of immigrants. However, immigrants do not bring with them the same economic footprint to replace the baby boomers who are retiring. Math gets it every time in Washington. Their solutions for a failed socialist program, well, we know. More socialism. That's our problem. The problem is not socialism. The problem is we haven't achieved full socialism. Raise taxes by increasing or eliminating the income limit on Social Security tax. That may happen, regardless of who gets elected. That may happen. Means test Social Security payments so that the benefit will be there for those, quote, who truly need it. I lost track of how many times Hillary Clinton said that on the primary campaign trail. We will protect and preserve Social Security for those, quote, who really need it. Well, what this means is the people who aren't going to get it are going to have to pay more for it. And then they're not going to get it. Well, that's redistribution of wealth. We know that. For decades, socialism was shunned. And liberals hid from the label. Oh, no. We're liberals. We're progressives. We're progressives. We lean forward like MSNBC. I love this. Socialism, where you wait on bread lines. Capitalism, where bread lines wait on you. I love that. Socialism was dying. Everybody in this room is old enough to have remembered it. We watched socialism die, remember? This is the New York Times, God forbid, showing in detail the death of the Soviet Union. We were there to see it happen. Or was it just slithering deeper into our country, little by little, just like they planned? Well, it's not hiding or creeping anymore. It's in your face. If they weren't holding Bernie signs, I think these were our kids. But they're holding Bernie signs. So I know damn well they're not my kids. They're not your kids. How do you get socialism to come out of the closet? You need two things. You need one crazy old socialist and a bunch of kids who aren't old enough to know that it didn't work the first time around. We only gave it 80 years to try. It didn't work. They don't know that. And they won't be told that. Socialism in the millennials. That brings us to the young people. I get asked a lot, what is a millennium? It's just a demographic term. There's no hard definition, but it effectively means this. A generation is roughly 20 years, give or take. The baby boomers commenced with the end of World War II, ran to the early mid-1960s. Then they started having babies. That's Generation X. By the early 1980s, we started giving birth to these people, who reached adulthood more or less at the beginning of the millennium. Now we get into the Pew Research. I'm going to skip this page. Let's go to this page, because this is one we really want to focus on. Pew Research took a sampling of 200,000 millennials and asked them to hang labels on themselves. And what did they come up with? Number one, self-absorbed, 59%. Number two, wasteful. These are they're describing themselves. 49%. Greedy, 43%. Environmentally conscious, 40. I don't know how you square that with wasteful, but they didn't learn squares. Then they run through the list. Idealistic, hardworking, entrepreneurial, tolerant, cynical, compassionate. I mean, it's all over the road, except when you get down here at the bottom. What are the bottom three? Religious, 12%. That's still thought we got a lot of work to do. Patriotic, 12%. 200,000 in this survey sample. And patriotic came up 12% of the time. Rigid, 8%. What do millennials believe that rigid means? Principled. If you're principled, you're rigid. This cartoon tells it all. Here's the kid in bed, millennials on the wall. Read the part again about how you're going to make evil rich dudes. Give me a free pony, a free Xbox, a free hoverboard, a free Bernie's fairy tales. So, why would these young people who describe themselves as self-absorbed, wasteful, greedy, environmentally conscious, and idealistic be attracted to a socialist message? Well, Frederick Hayek told us in the early 1930s. You can boil all that down. Young people have mush in their brains. They believe in utopianism. They haven't lived long enough to know that there are practical realities, that you have to work to survive and to thrive. So what do they hold up for? A European example. Bernie Sanders used it a lot over the last year. America needs to be more like Denmark. Bernie paints them as the portrait of an idyllic socialist utopia. Denmark, everything a millennial could ask for. $20 minimum wage, 33-hour work weeks, free university, free child care, free health care. FeelTheBurn.org. Except, if you're living in Denmark, chances are you're going to be pedaling around on a bicycle. Because you will not be able to afford a car. 2015, the average retail price of a Honda Accord sedan base model, $22,000. Price same car in Denmark, $49,000. The driver's license costs $2,500 US. And gas in 2015, $6 a gallon. Okay. If you did get a Danish job, the middle income tax rates are 30 to 48%. Plus everybody pays a value added tax, what we would call a sales tax, on everything they purchase, 25%. And Denmark has the highest household debt of any Western developed country. Hell, let's aspire to that. What Bernie didn't tell them, probably because Bernie didn't know, was to help stimulate. First of all, the Danes don't want this. Most of the Danes are sensible people. They want to get away from this. They want to be more like us. Bernie didn't know. They lowered the tax paid by evil corporations to 23.5%. Danish GDP per capita since 1957 has fallen to about 73% of the US. That's on a per person basis. But here's the thing that really kills it. Denmark has some of the highest wealth inequality, not income inequality, but wealth inequality in the world. Top 10% own 68% of the wealth. Yeah, it bugs them when you share facts like that. This fellow up here in the upper left-hand corner is the Danish Prime Minister, Lars Løkke Rasmussen. And he demanded, on the floor of the Danish Parliament, that Bernie Sanders stop pointing to them. He doesn't want them to aspire to what's gotten them into their own problems. I would like to make one thing clear. Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy. Well, they're trying to work in that direction. I love this quote. Scandinavian democratic socialism has miraculously solved the problems of socialism by slowly giving up on socialism. I haven't fully given up on it, don't believe that. But the fact of the matter is, Denmark just happens to be one of those European countries where the majority of the population has tasted socialism and they realize it ain't all that it's cracked up to be. How do we go about helping to prepare young people to see the truth? I like the waiter's parable. You ever in a good restaurant, you see the waiters working really hard, and ask them this question. You guys have to share your tips. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Let me tell you something, when they do have to share their tips, you're going to get a visceral reaction. Oh yeah, that stinks. I'm out here working my butt off, and Herb's over in the corner, he's not working, and he gets part of my tips. Young man, that's socialism.
That's right.
What? Maybe I need to take my Bernie button off. I started with my young kids, teaching them about Legos. Legos are a big deal in my house. I told my kids, when they were old enough to understand this, I said, okay, there's a family down the street, 3 or 4 families, and you know what, their kids don't have any Legos. Oh, Dad, that's terrible. What do you think if we took some of your Legos and gave it to them? Well, how about we get them some Legos and give it to them? Okay, I see that. What if somebody came in here and took part of your Legos by force and gave it to the kids down the street? No, Dad, that's wrong. That's stealing. And I said, yes, and one day you're going to learn that's called socialism. There's actually a website, deprogramyourcollegestudent.com. Don't get them out of the cult. Just remember, it's our responsibility. And because I'm president of the Lincoln Society, we'll end with a quote from Abe. America will never be destroyed from the outside. If we falter and lose our freedoms, it will be because we destroyed ourselves. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Do you have any questions? Is there something that you'd like to ask or something you'd like to add? Are we out of time?
No, we've got time for questions.
Very good. Yes, sir.
I was surprised you didn't mention Fabian socialism, and for example, the book Fabian Freeway, and the long, decades-long process of spreading socialism, beginning with the economic institutions of England and then into America, because a lot of these people, of course, are Fabian socialists.
As a graduate of the London School of Economics, I am eminently schooled on the Fabian Society. I didn't bring it up tonight because it's one of those topics that I think you and I would enjoy a cup of coffee over, and a lot of people are going, oh, God. There's a Coke with my name on it someplace. I'd be glad to talk to Fabian with you. Anything else? Yes, sir.
Yeah, you know, the past few
months when all this is beginning to happen with the way the voting's going to go and stuff like that. And you realize that there are socialists there, but I know some of the things that go through my mind is in Congress and the House of Representatives, just how many there, even they're called Democrat, Republican, it's getting to the point to me that doesn't mean anything no more.
No.
Because I wonder how many of them are socialists. Because sometimes, now, I'm just a plain guy, and I call up my congressmen, the two that we have here to take care of us, John Corden and Cruz, and I call them, I write them letters, I expect some kind of an answer once in a while, but not all the time. And I wonder if they get my messages or they just throw it in the garbage cans. Because there are just too many things that are going on, and it really makes you wonder about our government going into socialism. I'm beginning to feel that that's the way we're going to be, because I remember back in 1967, I think it was 67, when Johnson started to take away the money that we were putting away for our retirements. Because they didn't trust us that we could handle our money, but they could. Well, it goes to show that they can't handle our money. And they can't handle anything. They can't even get together on a simple vote anymore. It's like everything is a major project.
Well, I will tell you this, that I find that there are, in my travels in Washington, and I spent quite a bit of time in Washington, I think that there are, and it's not fair to pigeonhole, but there are three basic categories of people on Capitol Hill. There are those who would take your personal liberties and your economic freedom because they don't trust you, and more to the point, they want to be in charge. There's another group of people who don't think at all. They feel, they don't think, right? So they are transiently emotional, they're unprincipled, their ethics are situational, and they just kind of float around. Every once in a while, one of these liberal pinheads rubs up against a conservative principle. And then watch how quickly they back away from it when they get called on it. Okay? And then the third basic category is a minority, an abject minority, of people who understand what makes successful political systems and successful economic systems, and they may or may not be able to talk about it in academic terms. They may not be able to voice it knowledgeably, but they have a good belief system. I don't have any magical answer as to how you reconcile. We have parts of this country that are culturally devoid of the very things that we believe in, that we accept as an absolute truth. I don't know how you reconcile that. I don't. I can tell you this. In 2004, I was attending a dinner at the Russian Embassy in London, and a very prominent Russian sociologist had just published a paper completely funded by Putin. And in that paper, he predicted the dissolution of the United States of America, the breaking up of the United States into what he called superstates. And he predicted this in quite some detail along the lines of our cultural differences and the fact that they were so opposite to one another and so strongly held. Now, that's not something that I wish for, but something that was maybe fairly easy to shake off in 2004 in my own mind becomes less easy to shake off today.
Yeah, the vote that occurred in Britain.
Yeah. Would you like an update? Where's my phone?
We
Yeah,
are,
if I-
Leave is winning.
One of,
What's that?
Leave, Brexit is winning.
Yeah. Here's what I'm going to tell you, though. We're probably not going to know anything
130,000.
conclusively until the very early hours of the morning.
It's a long way to go.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Didn't mean to cut
one
you
of
off.
the arguments for the Brexit
Yes.
was that by stepping away from Brussels,
Yes.
Britain would be stepping away from some huge number, 14,000, 140,000 regulations,
Yeah.
just huge numbers. And I guess what I'm curious about
Yes.
is based on this Russian socialist. Would the argument apply to, say, Texas, stepping away from equal amounts of government control or regulation?
It might. It might. In the years that I lived in New York, I would speak to my father, who is now passed on. And every Sunday night, when I called him, the first question he would ask me is, how's life behind enemy lines? We can laugh about that. It's not true, though. Especially if you believe in your Second Amendment rights. Okay? I ain't gonna tell you where I hid my guns when I lived up there. The British thing is complicated. Okay? I have heard, I heard this morning on 660, I heard my good friend Mark Davis talking about it. It's easy to take what is really a truly complicated thing and distill it down into a simple thing. If you remove the United Kingdom from the European Union, you will remove socialist councils, a lot of incredibly burdensome regulation. And those are good things. But if you believe that Britain will be without those things if it leaves the European Union, then my friend, you've never lived in Britain. And I have. Margaret Thatcher transformed Britain in the 1980s. Never forget that it was Margaret Thatcher who brought Britain fervently into the European Economic Community, which was the predecessor to the European Union. Thatcher understood that Britain, the sick old man of Europe, economically could not really flourish by itself. The days of the British Empire were gone. Now, what Thatcher wanted by joining the EEC was exactly what she negotiated. Free trade, a much closer trade-based relationship with the continent of Europe, without surrendering sovereignty, and without buying into what would ultimately be called the currency exchange mechanism, which was, those were the building blocks of monetary union. And in fact, when Thatcher left office, one of her last speeches was warning Britons not to give in to the European idea of monetary union. I hold a degree certificate in the European Union. I will tell you that the European Union, as it was designed, was to be a three-legged stool. Political union, monetary union, economic union. They began with economic union. The reason they began with economic union is because it came out of the European coal and steel community. It was believed after World War II that if France and Germany could combine their coal and steel making efforts, then neither one of them could wage war against the other, because it was communal coal and steel. And in those days, you couldn't wage war without coal and steel. That's where the EEC began. The idea expanded to trade. There were 6 founding countries. Britain resisted joining for a long time. Then when they wanted to join, They weren't let in. If you go to Brussels today, and I've spent a considerable amount of time, I will tell you, most people don't know this, the European Union has 3 capitals. The real decision-making authority is not in Brussels. It's in Luxembourg. The real decisions are made in Luxembourg. Then the technocrats meet in, oh goodness, the day is wearing on. Help me, Neil. No. No, it's in Alsace-Lorraine. Anyway, it's the second capital of the European Union. I'll Google it for you later. Sorry. Anyway, that's where the technocrats meet, and they work everything out. Strasbourg. Thank you. Then the common masses come to Brussels to approve what's already been decided on. Okay, that's how Europe works. If Britain leaves the European Union, it will suffer. Make no doubt about it. Perhaps it's worth suffering. I'm not making that argument. But they will suffer economically. Jim?
So my son, he does a lot of work over in England, and
Who's he work for?
he works for a company called Tableau.
Okay.
So he said that the Brits, one of the biggest things are that it's the issue of immigration.
Absolutely.
I mean, one of the biggest driving factors for the Brexit folks is the immigration issue.
Makes perfect sense. Who knows their history? The English Channel was the greatest defense Britain ever had. I mean, ultimately, Hitler decided not to invade Britain because bombing them from the air didn't accomplish it. You have to have boots on the ground, but you got to get those boots across the channel. And Britain was prepared to repel. When Caesar led the Romans into Britain, he ordered that 2 lighthouses be built at Dover. One on one hill, one on the other. They're called the Pharos. One of them still stands today. They would light fires in the top of those Pharos. The idea being that even Caesar and the Romans knew that the safest way to cross the channel and to invade England was at night. Well, crossing the English Channel at night is not without a fair amount of danger. By lighting the 2 fires, at least they had beacons, so that the captain of the ships could always aim their ships to between the lights. And if they did that, they could make it into the Dover Valley, and from there into what would later be called Kent. If you ever go to Dover, and you go see Dover Castle, make sure you go out back and stick your head up in this stone structure called the Pharos. And you'll be placing your head inside of something that was built when Christ was alive. It changes your whole perspective on history. Britain definitely wants to protect itself against these masses of people that cannot be controlled. The Brits did something in the 1980s that a great many of us are starting to think about, which is just because you're born on this soil doesn't make you a citizen. The Brits did that in the 1980s. My eldest son, was born in the Great Portland Hospital in London, and he is not a British citizen. Because I am not a British citizen. And so he was not afforded that right and privilege. Yes, ma'am.
So with that being understood, what can you tell me about the mindset of the people who live in London who elected a Muslim mayor? If they're afraid of bringing more refugees in, then they're at ease with having him elected?
Well, there are a couple of things I'm going to say. First of all, the people of London, the people of Britain, just like us, are not politically homogenous. And the most unusual things can happen at any given time. Who would have thought 20 years ago that we would have elected Barack Hussein Obama? Not many of us, probably, right? Look, there is something you need to understand about British society. They are not afforded the same rights to speak their minds that we are. In Britain, you have what are called antisocial behavior laws. And if you speak openly against someone who is of a different ethnic origin or a different religion, with a different culture, you can be prosecuted for having violated antisocial behavior rules. Now, interestingly enough, if you're a woman, you're not a protected class. Women are still birds, they're femmes, they're babes, and they're expendable. You can say anything you want in Britain about a woman, but you cannot say something about a protected class. That kind of mindset, much like exists on our college campuses today, leads toward the persecution and the stifling of free thought and free speech. Okay? Look, there's no easy answer on Brexit, and anybody who tells you that there is wrong. You don't unwind something that you've spent decades getting into. I stand with Margaret Thatcher. I truly believe that if Margaret Thatcher were alive today, she'd be in Brussels with her purse and her fist on the table. Okay? I spent many days, many hours behind the scenes. One of my great professors in London was integral in the operation of the European Union, so I got to see a lot of things behind the scenes. Do you know that they still, in Brussels today, talk about the negotiations of Margaret Thatcher? That was in the 80s. Perhaps Mr. Cameron could negotiate like that. Maybe he could, maybe he couldn't. I don't know. It's not for me to say. But if Maggie were here, Maggie would probably be dividing. She would be parting the sea. She'd be seeking to protect the things that Britain needs for its sovereignty and its sanctity, and at the same time pursuing economic trade with their biggest trade partner. Brexit, if it happens, will cost the British people tremendously. And if they stay unchecked, it will cost the British people tremendously. Yes, ma'am. Let's wrap it up with one more question.
You're familiar with the Agenda 2 video where he shows that that Russia as a power structure is not dead, that they're behind a lot of the unrest going on in the world, infiltrating our churches and our schools and our government.
There's nothing new about that.
Right. Well, yeah. Well, I think that
It didn't stop.
right.
Today, it's not about.
The Cold War is over.
Well, today it's not about communism, it's about fascism. Putin is a fascist figure. Putin is the archetype Superman. He's the embodiment of that which makes the Russian people superior. Right? So propagating Russian ideology, Russian supremacy to the extent that they can afford to do so is something that took a little bit of break during the 1990s, but in the grand scape of history never really left.
What kind of trouble do you see China causing us?
Well, China believes inherently in the supremacy of China. It's built into the culture. 73, I did some of you know this because you saw my presentation on China. 73% of Chinese people believe that China is of the Han race, and the Han race being the purest, most intelligent, most supreme people on earth. And Xi Jinping believes very much in public policy and Chinese advancement to secure what China once was, which was the overlord of the Pacific Basin, and ultimately will be, in their hopes and aspirations, the overlord of the earth. They see that as the natural order. Now, how do you defend against that? We need another night for this.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.